These are the most interesting historical photos and unusual objects from the past. Let's get 100,000 subscribers. The photograph, in 1864, shows prisoners lining up for their daily rations at Camp Sumter during the American Civil War. Kalinin K-7 was a steel giant with 7 engines, twin booms, and a wingspan about 53 meters. It even had small cabins in the wings. In 1933, tests showed strong vibration at high speed, and the program ended early. May 21, 1979, crowds at San Francisco City Hall reacted to the Dan White verdict in the case of Harvey Milk. The White Night unrest sped up city reforms and gave the gay and lesbian community a stronger voice. North African desert. A German soldier stands by a cross for an unknown British airman, dated 18 June 1941. Even in wartime, opposing sides often marked graves with respect. This is Buzzy Trent, a pioneer of big-wave surfing on Oahu in the 1950s. In November 1957, he helped open Waimea Bay to modern surfing, riding a board over 10 feet long and chasing waves near 12 meters high. Early 1970s, this actor was on the kids' show The Electric Company, playing the easy reader character and sharpening his craft. That playful start came long before his calm voice and serious film roles made him famous worldwide. Western Front, 1917. Australian soldiers at a field aid post after Passchendaele. The man at left shows the 1,000-yard stare. The phrase became widely known in 1944 through a Life magazine painting by Tom Leigh. World War I doctors called this shell shock in 1915, marked by a fixed stare, shaking, and loss of speech in many frontline soldiers. Malaysian showman Ali Khan Samsudin handled king cobras and giant pythons, once setting a world record by living with snakes for 31 days. In 2006, a cobra strike during work forced him to stop performing. Breaker boys in Pennsylvania. Coal towns around 1900 were often only 10 to 14 years old. They worked about 10 hours a day picking rock from coal. Peru, 1939. Lina Medina, verified as the youngest person to give birth at 5 years, 7 months, 21 days, with Dr. Gerardo Lozada and her child. Atlanta, 1864. Defenders built spiked log barriers called chevaux de frise to slow soldiers and horses. These portable obstacles lined the city's earthworks throughout the Atlanta campaign. In 1922, Howard Carter opened a sealed doorway and saw the intact tomb of Tutankhamun, the only unlooted pharaoh tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Over 5,000 objects were recorded, and the find triggered a worldwide wave of Egyptian style in art. Hiroshima, 6 August 1945. The city lies in ruins after a single airstrike that reshaped the war in the Pacific. The blast signaled the start of the atomic age, and soon after, Japan accepted surrender terms. Built for the 1939 World's Fair, the parachute jump moved to Coney Island in 1941 and lifted riders over 250 feet for a gentle float down. In 1932, Australia deployed soldiers with Lewis guns to manage emu swarms damaging wheat in Western Australia. The birds sprinted up to 50 kilometers per hour, split into small groups, and the effort failed, later nicknamed the Great Emu War. Victorian cities paid rat catchers per animal, and top hunters earned bonuses for more than 5,000 in a year. Many used trained terriers and ferrets and searched markets, docks, and sewers. In 1939, Britain issued the infant gas hood, a sealed carry cot with a clear window and a hand pump to push fresh air. Nurses and parents trained to fit it during air raid alerts, and more than 1 million were produced. 1919. A Turkish bride wears a thin gold leaf on her face, a modesty rite in some Anatolian communities. After the wedding, the husband removes the leaf, and she then wears a public veil. Finland, 1918. Opposing groups face off during a power struggle after independence. The moment marked a turning point that set the young state on a new path. Richard von Krafft-Ebing, an Austrian psychiatrist, kept study photos like this in the late 19th century to document cases. His 1886 book, Psychopathia Sexualis, shaped medical language and court debates for decades. Late 19th century laws in parts of the United States and Europe let families have women admitted to asylums for broad reasons like hysteria or melancholy, often with little court review. Storyville, New Orleans, 1912. Women in a licensed district passed time with cards between shifts. The city kept Storyville open from 1897 to 1917, closing it under federal pressure in the war years. Shanghai, 1920s to 1930s. French photographer Louis-Philippe Meslier captured street acrobats performing under a simple frame for packed crowds. Traveling troupes showed balance and contortion acts with minimal gear. Lydia Litviak, the White Lily of Stalingrad, became the first woman recognized as a fighter ace with at least 12 solo aerial victories by 1943. She flew Yak fighters, painted a white flower on her plane, and still holds the world record for air-to-air wins by a woman. Mexico, 1916. Fortino Samano stands relaxed with a cigar in a now iconic final portrait from a time of upheaval. Witnesses said he even gave the order to begin, a bold act that helped make this image famous. France, 1944. USO performers prepared in tents soon after D-Day to lift the mood of Allied forces. Famous actors and band leaders toured newly freed towns, giving thousands of short shows each week. Oni, the railway mail service mascot, rode mail trains across America and even circled the globe in 1895. Clerks pinned route tags to his collar until it grew so heavy that Postmaster General John Wanamaker issued a special harness for his medals. New Haven, 1915. Yale's Whiffenpoofs staged a mock funeral at the Yale-Brown game after faculty banned their game day stunts. Founded in 1909 at Maury's, the a cappella group kept its singing traditions alive. Tokyo, 1934. Hachiko the Akita waited at Shibuya Station for his owner every evening and became a national symbol of loyalty. A bronze statue honored him, and the spot is still a famous meeting place today. A 1938 recreation of the dandy horse shows the push and glide balance bike first built by Carl Drace in 1817. It had no pedals or chain, and riders scooted with their feet, then coasted. May 1945, survivors of a week-long rail journey stand outside a holding site in Central Europe. Allied troops photographed scenes like this to document what they found and to inform later trials. Charlotte Johnson, Barbie's first fashion designer, created the black and white striped swimsuit and early couture outfits. Mattel sent her to New York and Paris fashion shows to keep styles current, shaping Barbie's look from 1959 through the mid-1960s. May 1962, astronaut Scott Carpenter splashed down about 250 miles off target after Aurora 7 and waited on a small raft as search planes homed in on his beacon. He was found after about 3 hours. Made in 1811 for the birth of Napoleon II, the King of Rome, this gilded cradle was a gift from the city of Paris. Eagles, bees, and laurel show the empire's symbols, based on a design by Pierre-Paul Prud'hon. Nairobi, 1966. The winner of the Miss Nairobi contest smiles with her ribbon and small cup. Pageants grew fast in the first years after independence, blending bright local prints with a new city style. Belgium tested mail by cats in the 1870s, training 37 cats to carry waterproof notes from Liège to nearby villages. Most took hours or wandered off, so the idea was dropped after short trials. This is a Tibetan furba, also called a kila, a three-sided ritual tool used in Buddhism to symbolically pin down negative forces. Many feature the face of Vajrakilaya and come with ornate turquoise sheaths like this. South Bend, Indiana, the 50s of the 19th century. Hundreds of cars in a crowded movie theater rushed to the giant outdoor screen. After the 33rd year, a real boom of car shows began in the United States, and by the end of the 50s, there were about 4,000 such cinemas in the United States. Milan, 1938. Piazza del Duomo glows as a giant portrait is projected across the cathedral during a state rally. Floodlights and draped screens turn the Gothic facade into a temporary stage for power imagery. Two Dutch workers gather fallen leaves along a tree-lined lane using a handcart and rake in 1919. Towns often kept such leaf piles for compost and animal bedding, turning cleanups into useful winter stores. A sea of fans fills the stadium for the Jack Dempsey vs. Gene Tunney title bout, more than 120,000 under the lights. Radio carried the event to millions, turning a sports night into a shared national moment. In post-war London, 75-year-old Mary Parish lights a cigarette for her 101-year-old mother, a snapshot of everyday habits then. In 1946, more than half of British adults used tobacco, and health notices on packs did not arrive until 1971. There was a small souvenir stand in Hiroshima in 1951. A few years later, street life returned, and these ruins later became the Hiroshima Peace Memorial, which has been a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1991. A German airship in 1916 carried an open deck with rotating mounts and curved rails for its defensive weapons. Crews worked in the wind at altitude to protect the giant craft, adjusting aim along the tracks while the canvas skin flexed around them. British troops inspect a captured Fi-103R Reichenberg in 1945, a manned version of the V-1 with an Argus pulsejet mounted above the fuselage, built for very short missions guided by a single pilot. A couple dances on a narrow ledge high above New York in 1931, about 650 feet up. Rooftop poses like this were popular in the early skyscraper era for publicity photos, with careful framing and crews managing the scene. A small metal dispenser holds a roll of postage stamps, with the slot guiding a clean tier. These pocket or desk holders were popular in the early to mid-20th century to keep stamps dry and ready, and the holes let you see the remaining roll. A compact tractor with chain-wrapped wheels pushes slush on a city avenue in 1925, its front hoist lifting the blade between passes. Many towns were shifting from horse plows to motor crews in the 1920s, cutting cleanup time and keeping streetcars running. French inventor M. Constantini rides motorized roller skates in 1906, each boot carrying a 1.5 horsepower engine with a small tank, battery, and ignition. The skates reached about 30 kilometers per hour. London's Victory Parade, on 19 July 1919, packed the streets as units and vehicles moved through the city. A temporary memorial, called the Cenotaph, was built for that day by Edwin Lutyens, and public demand made it the main national memorial. An American signet ring from the 1860s hides a tiny compartment under a hinged lid with a pop-up tip. Mechanical jewelry like this shows up in spy lore, but most surviving pieces were novelties prized for their clever design rather than any secret use. A soldier plays a tune on a worn piano in an empty classroom. Above the chalkboards hangs a portrait of Tito. Tito led Yugoslavia from 1945 to 1980, and his portrait stayed in schools for years as a quiet sign of a country that had ended. Signal workers ride an elephant to service a field telephone line in India in 1944. Elephants were valued as quiet, sure-footed lifts that could carry heavy reels and reach poles where trucks could not, especially in wet season areas. A crowd in Genoa surrounds a leatherback sea turtle, the largest turtle on Earth, which can reach over 2 meters in length and nearly 900 kilograms in weight. These travelers cross whole oceans and dive deeper than 1,000 meters to follow jellyfish. Stunt rider Joe Reed clears a 19.8-meter gap between buildings on a 250 cubic centimeter motorcycle in 1998. The leap reached 35.4 meters high and earned a Guinness World Records entry. In 1940, during the London Blitz, some people sheltered in church crypts, and this man even used a stone sarcophagus as cover. Each night, more than 1 million Londoners stayed in stations and basements until the alarms cleared. Men sell slabs of dinosaur tracks cut from the Paluxy River limestone in Texas in 1954. The three-toed prints come from theropods of the early Cretaceous, about 113 million years old, and the site was later protected as Dinosaur Valley State Park in 1972. Workers unwrap a crated Curtiss P-40 Kitty Hawk fuselage at a Casablanca assembly yard in February 1944 for free French units supplied by the United States. These planes were shipped in pieces to save space. A worker at a German doll factory in 1950 carries a tray of freshly cast baby figures ready for paint and drying. As the industry rebuilt, makers switched from fragile celluloid to safer hard plastic, and by the mid-1950s, West Germany was a leading toy exporter. A French warship lies frozen into the bay during the harsh winter of the Crimean War in 1856, its deck covered with netting and canvas. Crews propped the hull with timber to resist shifting ice, waiting for the thaw before the fleet could move again. Onlookers crowd the window as Audie Murphy gets a haircut in Farmersville, Texas, in 1946. He was the most decorated American soldier of World War II, earned the Medal of Honor at 19, and soon became a Hollywood actor. Allied soldiers read special newspapers announcing the end of the war in Europe in 1945. Radio and street vendors spread the news within hours, and huge crowds marked Victory in Europe Day on May 8th. This modest office housed Samsung Sangho, a small trading shop in Korea in 1938 that sold dried fish, fruit, and noodles. Its founder Lee Byung-chul later grew it into Samsung, and the name means 3 stars, a wish for greatness and long life. During the Romanian uprising in December 1989, Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife lifted off by helicopter from the party headquarters roof in Bucharest. The live speech that day drew open boos on television, a shock moment that signaled the fall of his rule. Robert Capa waded with United States soldiers onto Omaha Beach on 6 June 1944 and captured this sea-level view amid chaos. A darkroom error at Life magazine ruined most of his film, leaving only 11 frames now known as the Magnificent 11. This pocket watch recovered from the Titanic froze at 2:28 a.m., close to the moment the ship went under. Cold seawater and pressure stopped the movement, turning it into a quiet timestamp from April 15, 1912. A Kamaz truck carries the fuselage of a Mi-8 helicopter, repurposed as a rolling cabin in Afghanistan in 1990. Mechanics often reused aircraft parts for shelters or clinics when supplies were scarce, a clever fix for rough roads and remote areas. An early hand soldering iron with a thick copper tip was heated in a stove or lamp before use. The wood handle stayed cool, while the copper stored heat to join tin solder on roofs, cans, and small repairs. In workshops from Sheffield to Solingen, knife grinders lay on a suspended bench above a big water-powered stone so their body weight gave a steady, even edge. Water cooled the wheel and trapped dust, and some shops even kept small dogs on the bench for warmth during long shifts. At 17, Julianne Kupska fell about 3 kilometers strapped to her seat when her plane broke apart in a storm over the Peruvian rainforest. Hurt but calm, she followed a stream for 11 days until she reached a logging camp, becoming the sole survivor of Flight 508. In 1916, the German airship L-20, nicknamed the Raider of Loughborough, set out on deep-range missions toward Britain, but navigation slips and rough weather pushed it far off course. On 2 May, fierce winds and engine trouble carried it into neutral Norway. In 1916, William Coulthard solved a brick shortage in Vernal, Utah, by mailing about 80,000 bricks as parcel post, packed in boxes around 23 kilograms each for a route of about 640 kilometers. In the Chernobyl exclusion zone stands the Pine of Sorrow, a twisted tree with the plant visible on the horizon. Local memory links it to dark wartime reprisals by occupiers and partisans, and the site later became a somber memorial. This is a polehead hook used to open and close high transom windows, the tip catching a ring on the sash. Before modern cranks, schools and churches used long poles with heads like this to reach vents and control airflow. 7-year-old Mavis Hughes carries a giant harvest loaf to the Thanksgiving service at St. Mary Magdalene on Old Kent Road in London in 1951. The shiny button dress echoes the pearly tradition, and the big bread was an offering during Britain's Harvest Festival. A factory worker in Bedford in 1936 feeds thick chocolate paste through heavy rollers that crush and smooth the mix. The process, called conching, can run for many hours to turn gritty cocoa into a silky mass for bars and sweets. Italian tightrope walker Maria Spelterini crossed the Niagara Gorge in July 1876, once with peach baskets strapped to her feet, and later with chains and even a blindfold. One crossing took 11 minutes going forward and about 10 minutes returning backward. Cleopatra's Needle stood in Alexandria in the 1870s, but the granite obelisk was first carved for Pharaoh Thutmose III around 1450 before Christ and later moved by the Romans. Catherine Young, a widow, stands with her 9 children outside their home in Tifton, Georgia, in 1909. The photo was made by Lewis Hine, whose work on families and working kids helped build support for United States child labor reforms. In London in 1953, rat catchers pose with their terriers, dogs trained to follow scent and flush pests from docks and rail yards. Crews were often paid per tail and helped protect grain stores as the city handled huge food shipments after the war. French soldiers climb a snowy hill with a Saint Bernard and another dog in winter 1940. A village spread below. Mountain patrols use dogs to find lost people, carry messages, and sense avalanche danger during the quiet, phony war months before the May invasion. French gendarmes give directions to arriving German troops in Paris in June 1940, part of efforts to keep the city calm during the entry. 4 years later, Paris was freed, and France stood among the victorious powers in 1945. Lord and Lady Curzon ride a richly dressed elephant in Delhi during the Delhi Durbar of 1902 to 1903, held to honor the new Emperor Edward VII. Hundreds of princes, bands, and decorated elephants paraded to show pageantry on a grand scale. A woman stands watch at a protest in Tehran in 1979 as thousands gather in the streets. The banner says, "Yesterday's friends, today's rivals," capturing the sharp turn in Iran-Iraq relations on the eve of the 1980 clash. German U-boats lie stranded on the English coast, reminders of the undersea campaign of the Great War. After 1918, more than 160 submarines were surrendered, and many ended up beached and broken up for scrap along Britain's shores. Elizabeth Taylor, Montgomery Clift, and Eva Marie Saint study a thin 35mm MGM leader next to a wider 70mm strip while filming Raintree County in 1956. The bigger gauge let theaters project sharper images for epic stories. Early workers at Philips pose in Eindhoven in the 1890s, when Gerard Philips had just begun making carbon filament lamps in a small factory. From this lamp shop grew a European tech leader, later known for radios, medical X-ray equipment. In 2018, Sudan, the last male northern white rhinoceros, passed away at Ol Pejeta Conservancy in Kenya, with his keeper by his side. 2 females remain, and scientists are creating lab-grown embryos to keep the line alive. Chinese troops take cover by the Great Wall in 1938, turning old watchtowers into lookout posts over the steep valleys. Built in parts across 2,000 years, the wall still worked as a ready-made trench and signal line during those war years. A plush London showroom in 1905 displays open tourers with brass lamps, leather seats, and tiller-like controls giving way to steering wheels. Britain had only about 10,000 cars then, and most were hand-built luxuries shown like furniture in grand salons. In 1971, Australian rigger Paul Hogan works on the Sydney Harbour Bridge, bolting steel with the harbour spread below. A few years later, his jokes on New Faces took him to television fame, and by 1986, he starred worldwide in Crocodile Dundee. Two British tank crewmen, faces bandaged after their tank was disabled in 1944, pause together near the lines. New tools like penicillin, better field dressings, and early burn units sharply raised survival rates for wounded crews. Giant casks labeled 180 hectoliters ride a flat car, each holding about 18,000 liters of beer. Around 1900, breweries like Sternberg in Leipzig used rail moves and ice-cooled cars to send fresh lager long distances to city halls and festivals. A man on Maui in 1924 stands inside a wall of elephant ear plants, their leaves like umbrellas in a jungle of ferns. In the warm rain and rich volcanic soil, these broadleaf plants can reach nearly 2 meters across, turning every storm into a leaf-shaking show. British troops hugged the dunes at Dunkirk during an air raid in May 1940, waiting for boats to reach the beach. Operation Dynamo soon lifted more than 338,000 people across the Channel with help from the little ships of volunteers. Children play on a sandy street of Barasti huts and wind towers in mid-1970s Dubai, when it was still a small trading town by the creek. The first oil shipment left the Fateh field in 1969, and the new United Arab Emirates formed in 1971. A 19th-century lantern pistol let night watchmen light doorways and give signals while carrying a small single-shot arm. The lantern had shutters to control the beam, and most were short-range deterrents or curios, rather than serious tools. Soviet Ambassador Ivan Maisky addresses British factory workers in Birmingham in 1943 beside a newly built Valentine tank labeled Stalin. Britain sent thousands of tanks and trucks east under Lend-Lease, a supply line that kept the Red Army moving. In 1930 in Milan, thousands from Mussolini's youth group performed synchronized calisthenics across the stadium field. Italy used the Opera Nazionale Balilla for mass drills to teach uniform discipline and show national unity to the crowd. Arsenal's first team, then called Dial Square, lined up in December 1886 before their opening match. They won 6-0 on Plumstead Common and soon took the name Royal Arsenal, starting the rise of a London giant. An aerial photo from 1945 shows Berlin's wrecked blocks with the hollow ring of a gas holder still standing. After the battle, teams cleared millions of tons of rubble by hand, and the city began to rebuild. A New York dog walker leans back against a tangle of leashes in 1964, guiding a whole pack through the rain. Paid dog walkers took off in the city in the early 1960s as busy owners and high-rise living created a new urban job. The brief clash between El Salvador and Honduras in July 1969 is known as the Football War, but the games were only a spark on top of land and migration disputes. The fighting lasted about 100 hours before a truce, shutting the border, halting trade, and forcing tens of thousands to flee. A 1941 United States novelty pin cushion shows a cartoon Axis figure, used for home front humor and to hold needles. Items like this lifted morale and sometimes helped small fun drives. 4 porters in India carry a traveler in a covered palanquin in 1922, a common ride before cars were everywhere. These chairs worked well on steep hills and narrow lanes, with fares set by distance or time. Vietnamese activist Vu Thi Thang faces a 1968 trial in South Vietnam and receives a 20-year prison term. She answers calmly that the government will not last that long, and in 1975 it ends, and she is freed. This 1833 map shows Chicago as a tiny river town of about 350 people clustered near Fort Dearborn at the mouth of the Chicago River. Within a decade, the Illinois and Michigan Canal linked the Great Lakes to the Mississippi, and the town surged into a major trade hub. Early airliners in the 1920s used wicker chairs with no seatbelts because light seats saved weight and fuel. Flights were noisy and bumpy, so crews passed blankets and cotton for ears while flying low to follow landmarks. Jars labeled marijuana from a United States exhibit in the 1930s, the decade Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. The law grew from moral panic, sensational press, and agency lobbying rather than solid research. German leaders inspect a Jagdtiger tank destroyer in 1944, while crews stand beside other armored vehicles. The Jagdtiger was among the heaviest tracked machines of the war and carried a 128mm cannon. Harry Houdini draws a huge crowd outside the Vancouver Sun offices on March 1, 1923, doing a free outdoor escape to promote his show. He often used newspaper buildings and street stunts like this to turn headlines into full theaters that same night. On 10 November 1938 in Baden-Baden, uniformed forces marched detainees after Kristallnacht, the night of smashed shop windows across Germany. The roundup sent thousands to detention camps and signaled a sharp turn toward state-driven repression. Pearl Rambo, age 14, was billed as the world's heaviest girl at about 276 kilograms and toured early 20th century carnivals. She passed away in 1918 during the influenza pandemic. Inside the Great Pyramid's Grand Gallery in 1909, guides and researchers climbed the steep passage by walking in the floor trench and using the side ledges and beam holes for balance. The Korbeld Hall is about 46 meters long and 8.5 meters high. In 1933 London, officers were tossed from a pier into the River Thames to test a new life vest for harbor duty. Early sets used cork and canvas and had to prove they could keep a fully clothed person afloat in a strong tide. This is a spring wound dental drill. The dentist turned a key to tension the clockwork. Then the tiny burr spun as the spring unwound. By the 1870s, foot treadle and later electric drills replaced it, making procedures much faster. This handmade needlework book from Dublin, circa 1833 to 1837, holds real fabric swatches and a tiny dress stitched into the page to teach seams, pleats, and smocking. Such sampler books trained girls in schools and dressmakers' apprentices to copy exact stitches for custom clothing. Ruth and Elliot Handler, founders of Mattel, hold the first Barbie and early Ken, named after their children, Barbara and Kenneth. Barbie debuted in 1959 and sold about 300,000 in her first year. Rupununi Savannas, 1927. A Wapishana boy cooks wild game on a tripod rack above a low fire, a method that roasts and gently smoke preserves meat for travel. British Guiana, today Guyana. Photographers and researchers documented these lifeways. WrestleMania 1 in 1985 brought Muhammad Ali in as special outside referee, while Hulk Hogan headlined with Mr. T at Madison Square Garden, a crossover that kicked off a new era of sports entertainment. Indian troops wear early British smoke hood respirators in a trench near Fonqueville, France, on Aero 9 August 1915. Rushed into service weeks after chlorine first appeared on the Western Front, these cloth hoods gave basic eye and lung protection, but very poor visibility. German soldiers use a giant acoustic funnel to catch faint movement across the lines near La Bassée, France, in 1916. Before compact radios and radar, armies relied on sound locators like this to find patrols and even aircraft at night. Effective, but bulky. Inventor Don Pointer launched whiskey-flavored toothpaste in 1954, a novelty that even came in bourbon, rye, and scotch, with about 3% alcohol. Sold as a fun gift at drugstores, it became a small post-war craze that proved people would try playful twists on everyday items. This pocket medical kit from the First World War was sent to British soldiers, with a metal syringe, needles, and sealed ampules of then-legal stimulant and opiate medicine for pain and fatigue. Families mailed these to the front. German artillery shells lined up in Reims, France, 1917, show sizes from trench mortars to heavy howitzer rounds, with nose fuses laid out in front. By late 1917, some German guns could fire beyond 20 kilometers, and industry was turning out millions of shells each month. A street vendor in Buenos Aires in 1921 carries a shining cloud of balloons that turns the sidewalk into a tiny parade. Early vendors often used hydrogen or air, and the floating cluster became a hallmark of fairs and match days in the growing capital. Ella Hatan, called La Jaguarina, stands in armor with her fencing saber, photographed by Newton W. Gulick. In 1897, she beat 60 male opponents in foot and horseback contests, and was hailed as the only woman of her era to win champion titles for skill with many knightly arms. 7-year-old Drew Barrymore, fresh from E.T. the Extraterrestrial, presents a plush of the gentle visitor to Princess Diana at a 1982 gala. The film set box office records that year and briefly became the highest-grossing movie in history. A young Afghan flight attendant reviews papers with an airport guard beside an Ariana aircraft in 1972, when Kabul's air links were growing. In the early 70s, the national airline flew Boeing jets on routes to Tehran, Delhi, Moscow, and several European cities. Arnold Schwarzenegger playfully flexes for 2 amused ladies in the United States, 1970, as a rising bodybuilding star. That same year, the 23-year-old won his first Mr. Olympia title, kicking off a run that pushed the sport into mainstream pop culture. France faced a record flood in 1856 when the Rhône and Loire rivers overflowed, submerging boulevards in cities such as Lyon. Afterward, Napoleon III funded new embankments, levees, and early flood mapping that shaped river control for decades. Vyacheslav Molotov, Averell Harriman, and Winston Churchill at Moscow Central Airfield on 9 October 1944, welcoming the British mission. That week, Churchill and Stalin drafted the famous percentages note on influence in Eastern Europe. In the 17th to 18th century, some physicians used hollow walking canes that opened into a small house call kit with mirror, probes, tweezers, and vials for gentle remedies. The cane kept tools clean and hidden, while the doctor moved through busy streets to patients. On 13 October 1792, the first stone of the president's house was set on a site chosen by George Washington near the Potomac. 8 years later, John Adams moved in, and today the White House covers about 7 hectares with 6 floors. Members of the 40 Elephants, an all-female London shoplifting network, used hidden pockets and layered dresses to move goods past checks in the late Victorian era. Based around the Elephant and Castle area, they stayed active into the 1950s and became one of the longest-running female groups in city history. This is what 4 gigabytes looked like in 1959. Punch cards that stored about 80 characters each. Reaching 4 gigabytes took roughly 50 million cards, about 90 metric tons of paper filling a warehouse. During the 5-month siege of Paris in 1870, food ran short, and wealthy diners began ordering dishes made from zoo animals. Even the elephants Castor and Pollux appeared on special menus, and diners later said the taste was disappointing rather than exotic. In April 1945 near Scotland, a German U-boat had engine trouble and a high-pressure toilet failure that flooded compartments when the valve sequence was done wrong. Forced to surface, it was spotted by British aircraft and later sank, while the crew were rescued by a destroyer. A replica of a plague stone from 1666 shows how towns filled the top cup with vinegar to clean coins. During outbreaks, people paid for food by dipping their money in the vinegar first, an early public hygiene station in the open air. Linus, born in 1884 in Oregon, was famed for the longest mane and tail recorded on a horse, descended from a local long-haired strain. Shown across America as a symbol of Oregon beauty, he sired Linus II before his early death in 1894. Until 1956, many French schools served small amounts of wine or cider with lunch, and some parents even packed a half-liter for the meal. Health rules later changed. It was limited to older students after 1956 and fully banned in school dining rooms in 1981 under President François Mitterrand. In Durban, some Hindu devotees wore nail-studded sandals to show faith and to harden their feet before yearly firewalking festivals. The spikes trained balance and built thick skin, making short crossings over warm embers during temple rites more manageable. In 1942, Nazi leaders backed a climb into Tibet, but the team was detained by British forces in India the next year before it could search for the fabled kingdom. One member, Heinrich Harrer, later lived in Lhasa, wrote 7 years in Tibet. The word ghetto comes from Venetian Italian ghetto, meaning foundry, named for the casting yard in Cannaregio, where Venice required Jewish residents to live in 1516. Gates were closed at night and opened at dawn, and the term later spread across Europe to describe walled quarters in many cities. A British concept outfit from 1963 shows a family wearing full face visors and chest-mounted filter units for city drills. Designers pitched it as civil defense gear that let people walk, talk, and keep hands free during alerts in the Cold War years. A tuxedo cat nicknamed Unsinkable Sam was said to survive the loss of 3 ships in 1941, the Bismarck, the destroyer Cossack, and the carrier Ark Royal. Sailors adopted him. He retired to Gibraltar, and he lived a calm life until 1955. Adolf Hitler signs a copy of his book Mein Kampf in Germany in the 1930s, using public signings to boost his image. By the late 1930s, it had millions of copies in print and was often given as a government wedding gift, turning a political book into a common household item. Joe Arity, a Colorado man with an IQ of 46, was wrongly convicted in the late 1930s. Staff and inmates remembered his gentle nature and the toy train the warden gave him. In 2011, he received a full posthumous pardon. Louis, Marcel, and Fernand Renault built the tiny voiturette in 1898 and founded Renault Frères in 1899 after Louis patented a direct drive gearbox that climbed hills with ease. Early race wins made the name famous in France. Adolf Hitler sits in an open car during a speaking tour in Bavaria in 1923, when rallies, posters, and motorcades were used to draw crowds. That November, he was arrested after the beer hall putsch and, during a short prison term, wrote and planned for a larger push that changed German politics. In 1938, Dutch classes trained men to swaddle, bathe, and soothe infants using practice dolls. City family clinics promoted modern childcare and shared parenting well before the war. Engineer Carl Benz poses with his children on an early Benz car at the Mannheim Works in the 1890s. His wife Bertha made the first long-distance car trip in 1888, proving the design and inspiring early fuel stops at pharmacies. An Italian Alpino rides a wartime cable in the high Dolomites around 1917, where cliff paths and avalanches forced armies to build zip lines and aerial ropeways. These field systems moved troops, food, and mail across ravines in minutes. Some spans ran over a kilometer and saved hours of dangerous climbing. A pearl diver in Saudi Arabia in 1935 wears a rope basket for oysters, a nose clip, and finger guards, then drops with a stone weight to depths near 20 meters for about 1 minute. Before oil exports began in the late 1930s, pearling sustained Gulf ports with seasonal fleets, work songs, and strict pearl taxes. Samuel F.B. Morse, a painter turned inventor, built the practical single-wire telegraph and co-developed Morse code. In 1844, he sent the first long-distance U.S. telegraph message between Washington and Baltimore, and later received honors from several countries. At the first modern Olympic Games in Athens in 1896, 241 athletes from 14 nations competed in 9 sports, including fencing on small stages like this. Winners received silver for first and bronze for second. Gold medals came later, starting in 1904. A Victorian travel game set from about 1850 in Britain packs mini battledore rackets, dominoes, counters, tops, rings, and cords into one tidy case. Such kits grew with rail and steamship travel, offering quiet, etiquette-friendly fun for families on long journeys. Marilyn Monroe poses during a 1950s photo call, showing the bright style that helped make her a global film icon. At her peak, she was credited with more than 870 magazine covers across many countries. Albert Einstein in 1883 sits for a studio portrait in Germany. Family notes say he spoke late and liked to rehearse words in his head, yet by his teens he was working through calculus and playing complex violin pieces. In 1944, Mount Vesuvius sent a slow lava flow into villages west of Naples, filling streets with new rock. Ash also hit nearby Allied airfields, grounding planes and leaving one of the best documented eruptions of the war years. Republican soldiers in Spain talk with visiting reporters in 1937. The man with his back to the camera is Ernest Hemingway, then working as a war correspondent. His dispatches and time at the front later fed into his novel, For Whom the Bell Tolls, bringing the conflict to a wide audience. A horse-drawn poczta van works a Polish street in 1948, with parcels stacked on the roof and a clerk loading the rear. In the hard rebuilding years, many towns still used carts because fuel was scarce and roads were damaged, so mail routes mixed old wheels with new offices. A street seller in 1920s London holds up dolls as the crowd bids, a scene common at markets like Petticoat Lane and Portobello Road. After the Great War, cheap celluloid and stuffed toys boomed, and vendors turned handcarts and lorries into bright moving shop windows. Dancers from Isadora Duncan's company pose in Paris in 1920, wearing pleated gowns inspired by ancient Greece and dancing barefoot. Their free movement style broke from strict ballet rules and helped spark modern dance across Europe and America. Muhammad Ali chops wood at his Deer Lake training camp in 1974, building forearm strength and stamina the old-fashioned way. Weeks later, he shocked the boxing world in Zaire by using the rope a dope plan to beat George Foreman and reclaim the heavyweight title. A tiny roadside law office in Texas, 1986, with a false front facade and hand-painted sign. Classic small-town advertising before digital boards. In many rural counties, solo attorneys handled land deeds, wills, and oil lease paperwork from rooms no bigger than a living room. Crowds watch RMS Titanic leave Southampton on 10 April 1912 for its maiden crossing to New York, then the largest moving object made by humans. It carried Marconi wireless gear and 16 watertight bulkheads, promoted as modern safety at sea. Members of the WSG Hoffman paramilitary group stand in formation during training in West Germany around 1978. The group was dissolved by federal authorities in 1980 under laws against private militias and extremist activity. The Likov family were old believers who fled into the Siberian taiga in 1936 and survived for 4 decades on rye, potatoes, and homespun clothes. Geologists found them in 1978, learning they had built everything by hand and lived without radio, power, or news of the outside world. A Royal Air Force Lancaster rests at the edge of Lake Constance after an emergency landing in neutral Switzerland in 1944. Air crews who crossed into Swiss territory were usually interned under neutrality rules until later exchanges returned them home. Before digital edits, families sometimes scratched a face off a daguerreotype or tintype to erase someone after a quarrel or breakup. Early photos on metal or glass could be scraped with a pin, literally editing the image by hand in the 18th to 19th century. Arizona cowboys play horseback pushball in Phoenix, 1955. Riders drove a 6-foot canvas ball between posts like a giant soccer match. The novelty sport toured rodeos and fairs across the Southwest for a few decades before fading, but it made unforgettable pictures. In 1919 on Fiji, local lifters and European residents trained together in an early physical culture club influenced by Eugen Sandow and YMCA gym classes. Post-war strength shows like this helped spread organized bodybuilding across the Pacific, decades before modern contests arrived. Members of a German paramilitary fencing club run synchronized foil drills in the 1930s, practicing balance, distance, and timing. Between the wars, many clubs used facing lines like this to sharpen footwork and quick thrusts for speed and control. Crowds fill the streets outside Emisora Atlántico in Barranquilla in 1945, waiting for radio bulletins that the world conflict had ended. In that era, stations read official cables on air within minutes, turning plazas into live newsrooms for a final announcement heard across the city. Mstislav Rostropovich brought his cello to the Berlin Wall in November 1989 and played Bach for the crowd, a spontaneous salute to new freedom. The renowned musician had long stood up for cultural liberty. This portrait was recovered from the uniform of a young Japanese aviator who struck the battleship USS West Virginia on 1 April 1945 near Okinawa. Many pilots carried small photos as tokens from family or friends, a quiet link to home during the Pacific War. A 1950s photo shows Lieutenant Colonel Esteban Ventura, a Havana police officer under Fulgencio Batista, holding a sidearm. Known for harsh crackdowns and tied to the Humboldt 7 case, he fled Cuba in 1959 and lived in exile for decades. On 5 January 1975, the bulk carrier Lake Illawarra struck Hobart's Tasman Bridge, dropping a span and leaving 2 cars stopped right at the edge. The event cost 12 lives and cut the city in two until the bridge reopened in 1977. On 7 November 1941, Moscow held its Red Square Parade while the Battle of Moscow was underway, and several units marched straight from the square to nearby positions. The event lifted morale, marked the city's anniversary, and appeared in newsreels that showed the capital's resolve. A White Star Line, Emigrant Inland Forwarding Order, from April 1912 covered the overland leg after the ocean trip, such as train travel from New York to a final town. Many third-class Titanic passengers carried papers like this to link ship, rail, and relatives awaiting them in America. Soviet security officers detain a suspected foreign agent near Moscow in 1985, a snapshot of the Cold War cat and mouse. That year, both sides staged quiet exchanges on border bridges, and tiny cameras and coded notes were still standard kit. Ukrainian cleanup workers in protective suits sweep a field with dosimeters around 1986, photographed by Igor Kostin. After the Chernobyl reactor accident, teams checked farms and irrigation lines to map exposure and guide safe use of soil and food. Chernobyl cleanup crews carry graphite and debris on wooden stretchers across the roof of Reactor 4 in 1986, a task done in bursts of only seconds to limit exposure. Many were nicknamed bio-robots because the machinery jammed, so teams rotated rapidly, tossed fragments over the edge, and then were rushed back down the stairs.